Welcome to the Probability Podcast. Discussions on emerging and converging technologies, problems that are being solved, and the probability of positive and negative outcomes that we might expect. Now, please welcome your hosts, Jason, the generator Spracklin, and Patrick, the discriminator Lozon.
Hi everyone. The topic for this week is the impact of AI on the creative arts, such as music, writing and literature, filmmaking, and general art. While AI offers many benefits, it also presents challenges such as maintaining artistic authenticity, avoiding over-reliance on technology, and addressing ethical concerns related to authorship and ownership. So, the questions for discussion this week are, can AI truly be creative without achieving sentience? Will AI start replacing human creativity, or can it be harnessed as a tool to help artists explore beyond their creative boundaries? Can AI produce original works of art? And what are the legal implications when this art is based on source materials? And finally, what are the ethical implications of using AI to create art? So, Patrick, what do you think? Are we going to get the next Elvis or Jack Nicholson with AI?
Or the next Rembrandt. I don't know about that, but the idea is, if you look into the future, right, what's going to happen with capabilities of AI, and will it continue to evolve? So I would say yes, right. But if looking at what it can do today, it's capable of doing quite a bit now, specifically in the idea of helping, right, augmenting, as they say. So it can provide ideas and inspiration for artists to jump on board. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Mandelbrot set, but there's a whole bunch of art created around that. That was a kind of a fractal, images and stuff like that.
Okay.
All based on mathematics, right? Some really amazing, images have been created using that. So that's a good example where, mathematics and art meet, right? And so we also have AI being able to create patterns and images that are potentially, novel, right? And there's a few tools out there today. There's Google's Deep Dream, and it's actually dabbling in, not only fine art, but also, kind of a modern art point of view. So there is some potential here that's growing, right? From a point of view of paintings, right? And the visual art side of things, even though it's digital art.
It sort of becomes a tool, right? So we use it in this podcast, for example, right? We came up with the idea of having a cover art for each one of the episodes that ties in with the theme. And, we thought, given that a lot of the theme is around technology and AI, that we would start using AI to create imagery. And that's been sort of quite the journey for us, right? And that, you sort of, I find it actually useful because I can give it a description of what I think a good image will be for this episode. And sometimes I'll do it based on the topic. And then sometimes once the episode's done, I might go back and give it another run and see kind of what comes out. But as we've discovered, to varying degrees of success, that it's sometimes quite humorous, sometimes even scary, but it always comes up with some pretty unique things that I think that, while I'm sure, I've been immersed in the art world for a long time, and certainly humans can come up with their fair share of interesting things, but AI takes things, I think, to a whole different level of abstraction and weird faces. And, we were looking at the potential cover art for this episode today on creativity, and we had it create images around robot bands in concert, and we found it was, adding kickstands to robots and adding multiple arms on instruments, and just a lot of really crazy, wacky things, and it never seems to get the human faces right. It always seems to be the stuff of nightmares is what it comes up with in faces. In fact, a lot of the platforms have a button you can click that says fix faces, and I'm like, well, why is it that AI can't get the human faces right? Which is maybe they don't want to. We also notice that it always seems to create the robots so much bigger than the humans. It's like trying to assert its own dominance.
That's right. It is. We are your masters.
Yeah, exactly. That type of thing. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a number of different areas where I think AI could legitimately be used. And, even back to this podcast, for example. So we started with the idea that we would have an intro, a piece of music that would lead in, and then maybe a voiceover. So instead of, either me or you doing the voiceover, I found a platform, it was called like E11 or something like that, where I was able to feed in the text and have it speak the intro. And in the end, I ended up doing an outro as well. And what was interesting about that process is that initially I put it in, but it didn't seem to have like the cadence right around like how it was, kind of putting in pauses when it was speaking. It was either too fast or too robotic, and then I realized in the tool, I was able to add pauses and do different things in there to sort of tweak. And there was also a bunch of settings to tweak, like the variability, which meant instead of speaking in like a flat monotone, it would sort of give a little bit of variation in that tone. So it felt a little more human. I probably spent a good hour or more kind of tweaking this to get to the point where I thought it was relatively decent, although it still sounds fairly robotic in AI, but that was kind of the point. That it was supposed to be this kind of like voiceover for a technology show. So I do find it kind of interesting in a very meta kind of way that we have this podcast in which we talk a lot about AI, and yet we're using AI tools to create the podcast. In fact, the platform we're using for this to record this podcast, which is Riverside, has a feature where it can actually summarize your entire podcast afterwards. Of course, it gives a transcript, but it'll give a summary, it'll give talking points, it'll give quotes, it really gives you a lot to work with. And so I use that to sort of create like the description for the episode and so on. And in the future, I could use it to go, find other types of content to use in micro content pieces and so on. So I've actually been finding that AI has been like an indispensable tool to allow me to be creative, but also do it in a very kind of efficient way that, sure, I could have connected with artists to do the covers for this, but, that would have involved time and money. And, maybe that's something I will explore in the future, but it's certainly been an interesting journey of understanding how these AI tools can help just a single individual like myself or yourself explore some sort of creativity and put out something into the world. I thought that was a real light bulb moment for me that I didn't expect was going to happen.
Well, that's true. It really enables the average person, right? You don't necessarily have to master painting or music or a specific vessel, instrument. The idea around these tools is it kind of expands the capabilities of somebody who's not, a so-called expert in those fields to actually create, reasonable, right, material, right? So for us, it's great. Now into that next level, that's where the conversation starts. The idea that could an AI write a whole musical score, and would it be something that's worth it's going to echo through the decades, right? At this point, it can make some pretty good dance music and such, but it's all about the beats and the so on and the rhythms. But is it going to make the next? Well, it could be whatever the genre is, right? It could be classical, whatever those particular works of art are. It's I don't think it's really capable of doing that just yet. Now they've used AI to actually isolate John Lennon's voice, for instance, on an old demo song, and they've basically revitalized the song and released it. It's called Now and Then. So
yeah, I remember hearing that actually. It was pretty interesting in that it's like all of a sudden the Beatles 20, 30, 40 years later or putting out new music, right? That
Yeah.
would never have been possible previously because of, like you said, this AI tech being able to clean up these old recordings, which I think is pretty amazing, right? So that's outside of the actual creativity, because this is applying AI to bring something out, but it's certainly a really cool use of that. And what else can they do with that? With a lot of old recordings of artists there's so many talented artists that are no longer with us, and could we bring out new things from those artists based on old tapes and old recordings is definitely an interesting area for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and lots of very interesting questions come out of that too, right? But if you think about what else can it do from a tool perspective, it can help synthesize new types of music, new mixing and mastering. Um, it can help from a point of view of, if you have a block, let's say in lyrics, or you have a mental block about, certain musical patterns and, what notes you want to, what kind of score you want to create. I mean, it's good for helping, right? An artist. And if you look at, I don't know, some of the old 70s, like Pink Floyd, for instance, I mean, they really moved a lot into the synthesized music for a while there. What is an artist of 2024 going to do based on, if you had an AI companion to work with to on stage to build a live material, right? You never know, right? This is a whole new area for an artist to engage, right? And this could be really, quite interesting too.
Well, yeah, it could allow for some improvisation and that type of thing. I think what's interesting about this is that, back to talking about, could, AI, create music that's as powerful as, the signature artists of our time. And I think this is actually a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. I've been a massive music fan since I was like in grade 5, I think, and I think one of the things I've learned is that music has been set for a long time, right? There's certain music. I remember actually back to the Beatles. I remember watching an interview with Paul McCartney, and he was talking about songwriting, and someone asked him, well, how did you come up with this particular, song? It's so brilliant. And he said, well, I didn't come up with it. It already exists. And they said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, because these two notes like being next to each other. In other words, there's something natural in music that in which certain notes sound good together. There's only a certain number of notes in the spectrum, and really creating music is a combination of those things, right? And so then you could argue that, which many have, and in fact, if you look at music, a lot of music is actually math, right? It's different time signatures that are based on math. So then you'd think, okay, in reality, then AI should be able to create music. If music is math, and then AI can go create music. But here's the kicker, is that creativity is not based on math, because one of the things I also remember hearing in an interview from a virtuoso guitarist was, he said, go learn how to play, learn all the technicality of what it means to play guitar, learn all the notes and the scales, and he's like, throw it all away and forget it, because he's like, creating great music comes from the heart, it comes from the soul, and that's really the core of where great music comes from. And I truly believe in that. So I think, especially right now where AI doesn't have any sentience, who knows whether it could once it reaches sentience, that's a whole other subject. But it really is that, right? And it's a lot of the emotion that comes from music is based on human experience and surroundings and culture, right? There was a whole documentary that put out by the Foo Fighters where they recorded an album, where they did one song and in different cities in the US that were in states that were iconic in terms of creating a music scene, right? Where, like, jazz came from Louisiana, for example, and those types of things, right? Punk came from New York. And that music came out of a culture and a scene of people. It wasn't a calculated, somebody didn't sit down with use math to create those music scenes, for example, right? So I think that's really the crux of their argument to me. And as well, you look at, say like an artist like Led Zeppelin, right? That was one of the biggest, rock rock bands of the 70s, right?
Yeah.
Well, they were, back to that band, everything was based off of blues. If you look at even the early, like the first Led Zeppelin album is very much like a blues album. So everything is sort of a a copy of a copy, but they put their own spin on it. But at the same time, you can go and learn all those notes and you can learn the blues. You're not going to be Led Zeppelin, right? Led Zeppelin came from people that basically, loved music and spent every day listening to music, practicing music, and they honed their craft over many, many years to the point where they were able to put out something that was impactful on the entire culture. And it was also a product of the culture. So, you can use tools to build something. It doesn't mean it's going to resonate. It doesn't mean it has heart. It doesn't mean that it has soul, right? And I think that's the big problem. But yet again, I think it can be used as a tool. So I think that's sort of my argument. I've been waiting for this episode to talk a bit about this because there's a lot going on in the art community around AI, and certainly it's another tool, but it's not going to replace humans. It simply cannot, in my mind. And maybe there could be some interesting outcomes if it reaches sentience, if it has some sort of feeling and empathy and starts to behave like a human. I think it could be interesting. But music's also based on personality, right? And sometimes the cult of personality, and that a lot of what resonates with people is storytelling, right? And specific artists with a vision and a personality. And there's so many elements that goes into creating a great music artist, for example. And I don't think it can be manufactured at a lab. So,
well, that's true. I mean, music artists bring their own experiences into creating their own influences, into creating their next work of art, right? Whether that be, a mainstream strong song or something very original and dear to them that, never meets the top 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
An artist cares about the art, right? What they're doing. And everything doesn't have to be a hit, right? So then it goes back to, okay, well, what's a hit? Can you analyze all the hits? Can you formalize that? And can you generate new ones, right? Kind of pulling all the emotion out of it, and then building these what we call rhythmic, mechanized music generators, right? And that's where I feel that's the corruption of art, right? Where you're looking at just formalizing it, right? Versus, like you said, you talk about these different bands and what they do, what they bring forward. It's not all about, the next hit, the next, top 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's great when they achieve it, right? And, the more they achieve, the more famous they get, blah, 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 right? But the idea is, if you never achieve a hit, right, you're probably saying, "Oh no, you're going to completely disagree with me here." But the idea is that you're pulling together all these influences and experiences in your life, and you're putting that out into a work of art that really expresses that. Whether that's a hit or not is not as important as being an artist.
Well, true to most. Yeah. To some people, it's a little bit different. But actually, you make a good point around, there is actually a thing in music where if you look at a lot of the big hits over the last 20, 30 years, and then you kind of overlay them, a large percentage of them are based on the same melodies, the same note combinations. There is actually a little bit of a formula that is created. And this is where some of these big famous music producers, where they produce all these artists and then they get called a hit maker. Well, if you actually dissect that and look at it, it's actually based on the same formula. And I've seen a bunch of videos lately where it takes, a modern song by, say, Dua Lipa and showcases it next to a song from 20 years ago. And it's almost exact, right? And that doesn't mean that the person was listening to that song from 20 years ago necessarily. And this is why a lot of these artists have lost court cases, for example, because there's only so many notes and there's only so many notes back to Paul McCartney that sound good together. And so that combination means that every 10, 20 years, you're going to have the same things regurgitated because it actually sounds pleasing to our ears. And while there are, artists, jazz artists or the band Tool that does very kind of more, you might call it weird music, or in different time signatures, and they kind of go off the deep end of creativity. So you had the the band Tool created this song based on the Fibonacci sequence purposely as like to make it into art. So if you actually look at the song and dissect it from a math point of view, it's totally based on that. And interestingly enough, it works. I mean, I had no idea when I first listened to it, but anyway, I guess that's back to my thing around music is math ultimately, but then it has all these other ingredients that come into play, right? And it's also sometimes about capturing lightning in a bottle. So again, you can try and go in and kind of put something together in a piece of software and say, well, this is what I think is going to work. But look at an artist like Nirvana back in the 90s that came out with this album and Smells Like Teen Spirit became this massive hit that not only took a hold of millions of people, but completely disrupted the industry, completely changed what people thought was acceptable to be played on the radio, and really became this sort of bombshell in the middle of the music industry. You couldn't do that. Well, you couldn't formulate that. There's just no way, right? Yeah. The culture was ready for it. The music was sort of fresh. It was disrupting a scene that had become a bit stagnant. Like, again, there's so many different elements that come into what makes music popular. I mean, sure, you can use it to create music, but to do something explosive like Nirvana would be practically impossible. But maybe in the future, who knows? Maybe AI can figure that out.
Well, I mean, what is grunge? And then they break it down and isolate and say, hey, here's what it is, right? It's kind of trying to explain it. To me, it's just another explosion, another wave of a different form, right? Mm-hmm. And this was seeded by the experiences of the artists, right? And forging into something that's a little different, right? And will AI help that? An artist do that? I think so. But will AI itself, right, create those micro explosions and different forms of music? I don't know if it's going to be capable of doing that at this point in time. I do think, like you said, there's lots of if you look at a history of music and you look at the whole data set of music, the whole library of every song ever created, and you analyze all that, what do you have? You have originality, right? And there's the argument, right? Is will you put something new out there? Possibly something slightly new, right? But the idea is you're still working off existing works, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where what is originality? Originality comes from, like you said, the heart. It comes from the emotion. It comes from the raw experience, right? And it ties back, right? If you think about artists, the painting, the painting has textures. It's the process of painting itself has so many layers of variation. It's hard to build that into a process, hard to isolate. So, I think what you're going to get out of AI is, a lot of repeatable patterns and things like that. But true, amazing art, not 100% am I sold on that, right? I mean, there's virtual AI artists out there, like I think there's one called Hatsune Miku, right? Kind of a Japanese, I think, type of virtualized AI. The idea is, okay, it's in its own genre, right? And okay, that fits, right? It works because of that. It's that type of genre. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that type of, where AI is going to be generating or help generate or drive certain types, right? Certain classes of music, but it's not going to, replace the bar band,
No, for sure.
necessarily. Yeah. But then we get into, performance art, right? You've got the creation of music, but then you've got the performance of the music, right? Can AI help there? Well, I mean, AI can certainly help from a point of view of, helping helping sound engineers tune the environment, and set up the sound, get the perfect sound, right? Same thing with lighting. You can help and work along the soundtrack the band playing live and actually respond and create, visual effects and virtualized backgrounds, and not just play off a track, but actually be more dynamic. Right?
Yeah, more interactive, that multimedia side of things. And I could see that for sure. So a group that I've loved for a long time, Nine Inch Nails, I've seen them a couple times in concert. One time in particular, they had what I would describe as a mind-blowing multimedia type set, where they had all sorts of trickery going on that was interacting with the band. They brought a screen down in front that the singer was able to come out and like push out through virtually. And I mean, it was just, they had full on like visual meters that were going along with the song in the background. Now, a lot of this wasn't AI at the time because this was probably like 10 years ago. But thinking about what they were able to accomplish back then, I could totally see how an AI could create new opportunities in terms of multimedia presentation. You see a lot of that these days, especially with these sort of electronic artists and DJs. A lot of their whole presence is based on this huge multimedia light show with screens and interactivity. So it can certainly help out there. But, back to your previous point, I think that AI as a tool is an interesting thought, because when you look at it, if we go back to say like the 80s, right? When all this, I guess it kind of started in the 70s, but you certainly had in the 80s is when all the idea of synthesizers and drum machines and everything started breaking through in music, right? And you had so many people at the time kind of saying, well, this is a novelty. This isn't real music. All these things, because everything was very organic, other than maybe, a band like Deep Purple having a keyboardist or, that type of thing. But then it came into this whole idea of electronic music and dance music, and it was very much sort of poo-pooed at the time. But then it became sort of mainstream, and now it's, it's a major, major part of the music world. And that was all based on technology, and that was based on things that could not have been replicated by humans. If you back to the group Nine Inch Nails, a lot of what they put out could never have been done by humans, because it's programmed with drum machines in such a way that a human couldn't actually play it. But it still sounds very cool. So I do think, now that we're kind of deep into the conversation here, I do think that AI could, kind of cause some very interesting things to emerge, even musically, that were never thought of or never possible. And it becomes this other tool, this extension. And that's the way these artists used drum machines and samplers and all these things back in the day. They use it as an extension of creativity that let them push into new areas and actually created new genres of music. So in a weird way, I'm not saying this is going to be as good as Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd, but in its own way, AI could start creating sort of a new sort of genre, a new style kind of music, or enabling that through as we talk about the human in the loop, that was never possible before. But of course, we have a lot more to talk about today than just music. And if we stay on the music topic, then it's going to be the whole episode, because that's my heart and passion.
Well, but I mean, it's an important thing I think the main message we're talking about here is that with, artists being enabled and being aware of all these tools and utilizing these tools, we're going to see a whole new, creation, a whole new development of material that we've never seen before and never heard before, in this case with music, which is very exciting, right? I mean, think about from a performance point of view, what could they do with, 3D projections and virtual projections? You go to a concert, what are you going to see in the future with what AI can do, right? You think about the lyrics in a song and how they're painting a picture that could be brought to life, in multiple different ways in a multimedia fashion. Not only do you have the music, but you have the whole full embedded experience. You've got a whole new, experience, but a whole new exposure possibly here, right? That people would just say, they go to a concert and they say that was the best thing we've ever seen, right? It's the best thing we've ever been involved with, right? Think about the fact that we could have reactive, we could have systems also reacting to the audience itself, right? And the music being modified on the fly. And there's a lot of very, very interesting combinations here.
I don't know, Patrick. Somewhere Elvis is rolling in his grave here, and hearing you talk about that, I don't know. No, I totally get it. We talked about this, I guess, a little while ago about the band ABBA that's doing these hologram shows, right? Where they've basically done a lot of motion capture on the band, and then they had this company has this technology with holograms, but they actually had to build an entire arena in Sweden or wherever to actually accomplish this, right? And I think that now that technology is growing every day through AI, eventually they'll be able to create something like that they can take on the road. In fact, the band Kiss just basically sold the rights for their company to do the same thing with them, and they went in and they did this whole like days and days of motion capture, and then they're going to translate into holograms. But if you think about it, if AI was introduced into that mix and able to study the band members, like you said, then maybe it could be interactive to the point. And I think that's what, it's an interesting thought process around it, because, for guys like us that grew up on very organic music, and, we still love technology, but we can be a bit iffy about how it gets integrated. But for an artist like Gene Simmons, who might have the biggest ego in all of rock and roll, the idea that he could live forever as a hologram and go on tour and, maybe even go on talk shows or whatever, right? Like the idea that they could live forever as a band, I think is very appealing, because if nothing else, the only thing that oftentimes supersedes the ego is their musical talent, and sometimes the other way around. But anyway, I think
what do we have? Buddy Holly, right? A bunch of black and white, what's left, right, in history. And we can never really appreciate that, right? What that particular artist, or any of the artists from the past, where, we didn't really have good media recordings.
For sure.
And so again, we're trying to revive history, and it's not all about reviving history. It's about creating something new too. So, So we also talk about the dangers here, right? Let's get into that. I mean, we all know deep fakery is bad news, right? Mm-hmm. It's bad news for, stealing, recognition. It's bad news for, trying to manage copyright and reward and compensate the true artist, right? And could it in effect displace people, right? And yes, the answer could be, if you have AI systems that automatically set up everything for sound engineers, well, we don't need 4 sound engineers. We only need 1 now, right? Mm-hmm. This is reality. It's not a good one, but people are possibly just being displaced through some of this, right? Another thing is, what is going to happen in the future? We talk about this, these new genres and these new capabilities and blah, blah, blah. Well, are we going to get a tsunami of AI music out there? Right?
I think it's already starting to happen.
Yeah,
essentially. And you have people that have created songs by artists that are currently recording. Right? There's been fakes of Drake and other people put out there that have actually spread virally, and people are enjoying them, which must be pretty disconcerting to an artist. But it's I think that's a big danger to the artists themselves. But I do think back to the earlier conversation, though, is that I still don't think. I mean, it may fool somebody briefly, but it's still not going to replace the heart and soul of an artist necessarily. But at the same time, we're in an age where music has been very commoditized, right? And it's become very, very much of a product in many cases, and there's not a lot of discernment, right? If someone like us sits down and puts on a vinyl record, and we want to sit and listen to it and appreciate the nuances and everything else, that's fine. But for a lot of people, music is just the background of a TikTok video or something that plays in the car, and they're not really paying that much close attention. Essentially becomes that. And then so whether it's real or whether it's AI, at that point, if it sounds good, maybe it doesn't totally matter to them. And that's also valid as well, right? Not everybody's going to be the level of music fan that I am. But, but then again, people get used to things. So I'll give you an example of auto-tune, right? I don't know how much exposure you've had to, given I know like your genres of music, but in a lot of modern genres, auto-tune is a huge thing, right? And it initially was conceived as a way to fix vocals, right? For people that weren't necessarily, a top of the line singer, like Madonna or Lady Gaga or whoever, they could go in and record, and then they could use autotune to fix things that were essentially out of tune or not quite, if they didn't quite hit that note, they could use autotune to kind of fix it and bring it back into the line. But what ended up happening was it sort of started to sound a little bit fake, right? Where you'd hear something, you're like, okay, well, it sounds like they're hitting the note, but something feels fake about it. And then it got to the point where that fake sound became a trend, where people were purposely and actually going over the top with it, to where I hear songs where these auto-tune vocals come in that are actually, I know they're purposely made to sound that way. And for me, it just, I can't, I just have to turn it off. I just can't. For me, it doesn't resonate with me, but it's actually become like an instrument in modern music to have these over-the-top auto-tune vocals. So extrapolate that out to AI, to where, like you said earlier, maybe there's going to be a whole new genre of people, and what's your favorite music genre, right? It's not heavy metal, it's not hip hop, it's not country, it's AI, right? AI is my new favorite music genre. I mean, it's not that far-fetched, if I correlate it back to something like autotune, where it could start to become like its own thing. And I think like you mentioned, it's already starting to get there. There are artists on Spotify, quote unquote artists, that are using AI to make music, that are getting more profit and bringing in more audiences than actual artists, because they're just proliferating their music, this AI generated music, through all these playlists. I was reading an article one day about how an artist basically said that there are essentially quote unquote fake artists out there making more money than they are on Spotify.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. Right.
Yeah. So, I think to me, that's just utilizing the technology to, monitor a monetary benefit, right? If you think about what are you trying to achieve, right? Oh, I just want to make money. Well, great. All right. But, are you going to make, are you going to compose a piece of work that's actually going to, stand the test of time, right? It's going to make something, very unique, right? And that's where I don't want to listen to it either, right? The intent there to me is, sure, it's great if you're like us, right? We want to put on a particular, podcast, and we want to have a nice little theme music or something. It's very easy for us to put something like that together. That's great, right? But we didn't want to hire a band or an orchestra to but put a little score together, right? It's for us. It makes sense, right? But if you're generating music, right? If you're creating, if you're being an artist, the idea is you got to be an artist, not just push all the work over to some automated, generation capability, engine there that just, puts out formulaic music that's not tied to any kind of emotion. It's just, repeat upon repeat. I'm not a fan, and I feel that in the end, there's always going to be these genres at the end of the outliers that people are going to like, but the true stuff, that pulls at your heart and, is memorable, is going to continue to come from artists, right?
No, I would agree for sure.
Yeah.
And but I do think there's an element of creativity that, where someone might be able to use AI or electronic instruments or whatever it is in combination with AI, because they already have a point of view, they already have an emotion. And if this technology gets really good, it sort of comes back to this idea I was reading the other day of democratizing creativity and music output, or any type of creativity, I suppose, right? Because there are a lot of barriers to that oftentimes. And, one of the things, if you read about creativity itself, like just as a sort of singular concept, all of us have creativity inside of us, right? We think about these artists, whether they're an actor or a musician or a writer, we think somehow they're different than us. We look at them like, sort of special human beings. And in some cases they are, don't get me wrong. I mean, like Jimi Hendrix, for example, right? Who was just like an alien who, nobody has sounded like him since. And why is that, right? But
Sure.
I mean, we all have creativity within us, and I've always felt that. And so I found different avenues and different outlets to sort of express that out. but oftentimes you don't have everything at your disposal, to where that's where something could be helpful, right? Maybe you learn how to play bass guitar really well, but logistically, it's difficult for you to go out and find people, create a band, book a recording studio, all these things. But with electronic music and then potentially AI, maybe you could bring some sort of creative vision to life that you couldn't have necessarily done before, given some of the restrictions or limits on things. So I think it's kind of, you can look at it two ways, and I definitely agree with you. I don't think AI is going to create, the next Led Zeppelin, but on the other hand, it sort of can democratize things to where, I mean, that's what sort of digital platforms have done, and software on, you can basically record a song or an album on your iPad now with something like GarageBand, right? And a fairly cheap microphone. It may not sound amazing, but technology has allowed things to become easier to access. For example, back in the late 90s, I actually took a recording arts program and learned how to do studio recording, which was largely in these huge recording studios with microphones that cost thousands of dollars. And some of it was computerized. It was fairly early, but a lot of it was recorded to, physical tape that you had to actually slice. And there was a lot involved. In fact, a lot of artists couldn't actually put out music because of the cost and effort involved in doing so. And then all of a sudden, here we come in the 2000s, where you can record everything onto a computer, and then later on you can publish that yourself to Spotify. And now you no longer need to have a recording studio or even a record company to put out music. And there have been some pretty amazing artists that have emerged from that. So while I don't think it's a one size fits all type solution, I do think this will probably enable a lot of people to explore their creative selves.
I agree. And the idea is then, is it augmentation, right? Or is it that the AI is leading the charge from the point of view of creativity? So as long as this, we have that line of, well, the true creative person is, the artist is the lead, right, on this, and the AI is the support. Then, that's where, to me anyway, that's still maintaining that magical, balance, right? When we start looking at in the future, if an AI itself becomes a virtuoso, right, a composer, well, that's a whole new thing. That's a whole new ball game, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we covered a lot on music. So what about let's get into some other areas of creativity, for example, like writing and literature.
Yeah. So when we think about it, it's already being impacted today, right? It's incredibly today. The idea of, can a person utilize AI tools today to help them write? Absolutely. I think everybody's taking advantage of that. If not using Grammarly, then using ChatGPT or using the Copilot along with, Word and other, types of tools for writing. The idea here is that, of course, again, it's more of the augmentation side. But I remember when I first started playing with ChatGPT, I wrote a little story. It was about 3 sentences long, and I said, take this story and make it, engaging, right? Build it out and provide a theme and, derive a true sense of purpose for this story. And it came back with, a page long short story, right? And it was pretty impressive. It impressed me. I'm a writer. I write a number of novels now, and I look at that and I say, okay, well, that's really interesting. It was really, well refined and worked really well, and it was. But if you start breaking it down, it was a formula, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, and from an artist, i.e., a writer, they're going to not follow a formula all the time. Right.
Yeah, well, it started with an idea that you gave it, right? Ultimately, it still started with you. You gave it something and said, extrapolate on this. But yeah, like as some people may not know, Patrick's written a number of science fiction novels. You can find them on Amazon if you want to track those down and support them. But what was your sort of thought process though around, okay, it was formulaic in that, but did you see some potential on how it could almost become a little bit of like a brainstorming tool where you could kind of say, well, I have these ideas, let me feed it in, let's see what it comes out with. And then maybe I'm not going to take that and use it like verbatim or like rewrite it, but could it kind of help you extrapolate, oh, I have an idea I want to explore. Could it become that sort of like writing or creative partner, given that it can, read like 100,000 pages a minute of all the materials out there and come back with you and say, well, you have this idea, maybe here's a couple of different directions you could go in with it, and then you can kind of take that and run with it. Do you see it as being a bit of a creative tool potentially in terms of writing, or what's your perspective on that?
Well, I say yes, you could, right? But then again, as a writer, is that the part that you want to utilize AI for, right? To me, I mean, I definitely want to have it utilize the syntactical side of things, right? And to do the editing and the grammar checking and blah, 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 right? I don't want it to give me the ideas necessarily, right? To drive the plot and the storyline and the themes and the character building. I want to do that. I want to be in control. So the next question is, okay, like I said, I've written a few novels, right? I got a lot of hours. Was it 10,000 hours? Right? But if somebody wants to write something small and doesn't have that background, can they utilize the tool to help them? And yes, right. But the idea is, you shouldn't take that and publish it.
For sure,
that's not your work of art. I'm sorry, right? So that's I think where there's a concern of fake authors, right? Fake authors going out
originality and that type of thing.
What is that, right?
So what does your process look like? For example, like you mentioned, okay, I wouldn't want to use AI for that. So you kind of have a kernel of an idea, and then it's through, I suppose, spending time and iteration and probably thinking, using your imagination. Like I'm just kind of spitballing here, but what is your process to take something from kind of an idea to a written piece of work like a novel? Like in a nutshell, like what does that process look like for you?
Well, I don't know if I could, pontificate upon that all the way to say, here's a process, right? I don't have a hard and fast particular process, but
it's interesting then. So it's not a defined process. Then how do you make it algorithmic, right? And I guess that's your argument, right? That I don't sit down and just follow a process, because if as a creative person, it doesn't quite work like that. So maybe that's the argument against AI being able to truly be a writer, because it'll follow a process that, like you said, makes it very formulaic or generic, for example, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about all the different artists out there, and they've had these interviews and they talk about their experiences, and artists can put together a work, whether it be literature or art or what have you. But they'll do it, in one night, or they'll have an idea, and they put something together, and then they leave it because the time wasn't right. They were missing something, and then 3 years later they have it and they finish it. That's the root of creativity there. That's that's where we pull in the experiences and the understanding of what we're seeing around us, and how we're building that out into a particular piece, right? So that's what I mean by process. There's many writers out there who started novels and then put them to the side, and then came back years later to revisit them and finish them. Because
they get writer's block, for example? Like, do they get blocked and then they can't quite finish the idea? Like, could, just to play a bit of devil's advocate, could AI help people relieve some of that writer's block and kind of throw a bunch of ideas at them and go, oh, okay, maybe I didn't think about that. Let me take that kernel of an idea now and go explore it? Or is it not quite that simple?
Well, it's possible. right? And that's where it's up to the individual to pursue that. So there's definitely that, capability, that type of collaboration with AI that could be very helpful, along with the mechanical side of things, like I said, the editing side, right? But that, in the end, does that devalue the work, right? If you look at AI just churning out, gobs and gobs of stuff, right? That does that devalue human creativity, right? Because it can put out this perfect prose, right? Oh, you want to do poetry? Here's a whole bunch of poetry for you, right? Thanks, really appreciate that, right? I think the idea is that who is the reader here, right? Who is the audience, and they need to be able to decide what they're going to discern as valuable, right? If the fake's okay for them and they love the fake, and so the AI is just fine, well, that's great. But what's true art, right? And you want to from the true artist. So the other side of it is you think about what is bias. We've brought up many times. Bias is representative in the data set of the AI, and so will that, in fact, poison, right, the output a bit, right? Will it make it incomplete? Will the work that's being created just not? It's just like your sour note, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was just off a bit, it wasn't, whereas some artists, they use the flats, right? They actually migrate the music into the utilizing those flat notes, and you think, well, it's off, but it's off in a beautiful way, right?
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas, it's like the screech, the fingers down the chalkboard when the AI does it, right?
No, absolutely. And I mean, you have, like, for example, if you look at the way, say, generative AI works right now, right? And people are using it for writing and so on. So what is it doing, right? The language model is being trained on data. What is that data? It's all the collective works of art or writing. Let's just bring it back to literature, of all the books and everything that have been written that have been run through the language model, essentially, right? And so it's going to take that and spit it out in some sort of way that it feels like it makes sense, because that's all it's doing right now, right? It's not sentient. It doesn't have a true understanding of what it's reading, and sometimes does a relatively interesting job in terms of the output. But like you said, it's usually formulaic. But then again, back to creativity, oftentimes that's how people start in terms of being creative, for example, right? So there's a quote I love from Kirk Hammett, who's the guitarist for Metallica, where he said, to imitate is to create. You have to start somewhere, which I always loved, because I thought, yeah, you know what? When I look at so many artists, and even in my own experience in music, that oftentimes what you start with is sort of emulating something that you love, right? So bands will start out by writing music that sounds like Pink Floyd or sounds like Black Sabbath, because that's what they grew up and they love. And that gives them a bit of a vehicle to move forward and kind of create their own music. And hopefully eventually they find their own sound. There have been, great examples of artists that have started out sounding very much like their influences. And then by their second or third album, they kind of come into their own. They find their own depth of originality, and they, in some cases really push the genre forward, but they started out by imitating. And so I guess where I'm going with that is essentially that right now, given the current state of AI, and especially generative AI, you're really only going to get a copy of a copy, to quote a Nine Inch Nails song, right? It's not really going to be capable, I think, of coming up with true originality, and maybe through some happenstance or whatever, that maybe it'll come up with something that maybe sounds original, but it's still based on a data set. Whereas like original music and like new sort of genres or new takes on genres, for example, and we're getting back to music here, though, is truly based on an author's experience, their life experience, their exposure to culture, their, whatever it is. And that's the same thing with writing, for example, right? That some of the greatest stories and movies and films of our time have been based on truly sort of original ideas that maybe those artists started out by sort of copying other filmmakers or other writers, but eventually sort of really found their own voice. And that's where I see some of the limitation existing right now.
Yeah. If you think about it, like, Michelangelo said that, the sculpture was in the stone. I just had to clear the rest of the stone away, right?
Yeah.
The idea that if you talk to artists, that's what they'll say, right? They will say it was there all along. I just had to clear it all away and expose it, right? So there's something above and beyond just, the mechanicals, beyond the math, right? On the creative process, right? It drives this inspiration, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's what's really important, that we cannot lose, right? So, are we going to lose it realistically? No, absolutely not. Are artists going to, give up the ghost tomorrow and say, "Oh, AI's got my job, I'm leaving. I'm gonna have to work in the factory now"? No.
No, not likely. I mean, most artists honestly don't really look at it as a job, and surely, like, a lot of them try to monetize things and they try to turn it into a career, because who wouldn't want to do something you love as a career, right? But at the end of the day, they're still doing something because they love it, and that AI is not going. They're not going to wake up and go, "I guess AI is just creating things now." I'm not going to, because there's something deep inside that motivates an artist, in which they want to express themselves or put themselves out into the world and perform and get in front and have those human connections. And those things cannot be replaced. And maybe they can be augmented, like we said. But what about, merging into a topic like film? And we've certainly seen a lot of proliferation of these. We've talked a lot about image generation, but now we're seeing video generation. And in some cases, pretty impressive, although they're probably heavily influenced by a human in the loop and giving a lot of prompts and a lot of source material. But, a singular person could sit down with a lot of ideas and source material and feed it into an engine and create a video. I've seen, TV commercials, movie trailers, all kinds of things, created through these video engines and AI, and to some degree of realism. Although I will say that it always feels like there's something slightly off. Right, it's back to the idea of the uncanny valley.
Yeah.
I don't really even know how to put it into words. I guess it's sort of a fake veneer that's over things that I've noticed in these videos. And we've had these discussions before, right? Where you're like, well, if you didn't know it was an AI video, would you say it was an AI video? And I'd say there's probably times when I've been, at least temporarily, legitimately fooled, which makes me think, give it another 5 years and we'll be off to the races. But everything I see right now is slightly off in some sort of way, and in some cases almost feels creepy or unnatural. But the capability of AI to generate some of these scenes, I think maybe the creepiness sometimes comes from that it still can't quite get humans 100% right. We've seen that in the pictures, right? We were going through the pictures I generated for this episode about creativity, and it can't quite seem to get faces right, and it adds extra limbs, and there's always some distortion there. And you see that in the videos. But when you see a video that's like a car driving through a canyon or something, I mean, in some cases, it's pretty mind-blowing what AI is able to do right now from scratch. And I do think, while I don't think it'll replace actors necessarily, although we'll see to what degree, maybe extras in a scene, right? If you look at the show The Walking Dead, they have these sort of swarms of zombies, and most of them are AI, but the ones in the front are humans, because if it was all AI, it would look a little bit too fake, for example. But certainly in terms of like visual effects and being able to like democratizing that, right? Because up until now, you have these huge animation studios and Industrial Light and Magic that are only able to do these things. But when you see what direction these tools are going in, the average person is going to be able to conjure up some pretty fantastical things from like a CGI kind of point of view. So what do you think in terms of film and that sort of thing, and where we're headed?
Well, I agree with you 100%. You think about, and this gets back into displacement, right? Where you had whole companies doing special effects, and now you can do it on your PC, so to speak, right? The level of, we talked about CGI way back then and now what you can build out on your, for the green screen, so to speak, for your films is incredible. Are people being displaced? Are jobs being lost? Absolutely, right? Because the tools are getting that much better, right? Can we make full AI generated films? It's I would have
We're on
said
our way.
no but I've done some research. There's some movies. There's Sunspring. There's one called The Frost. There's one called Plastic. There's one called Given Again. Another one, Critters. So these are all full featured AI generated films, right? There's one full motion movie being developed in India, Maharaja and Denims. I think it's a time. Okay, I'm not making this stuff up.
I think AI wrote that one.
Yeah. Oddly enough, the script writer was a person, but they're using, they're basically building the film virtually, and at 1/16 the normal filming process. So here's my concern. In terms
of cost and everything, yeah.
Here's my concern. The Hollywoods out there, there's multiple Hollywoods. They're just going to jump full-fledged into AI and start making AI crap, right?
Well, to save them money, right?
To save them money, right? It's all about money, right? And to me, that's really irritating because I don't go to a movie to see formulaic crap, right? I go there to see something I've never seen before, something that is, the original, right?
And for sure.
The ideas behind it and what's that comes from many different people. You always talk about Star Wars and George Lucas. He was from a science fiction point of view, is a visionary. No, George and his crew were visionaries.
Together they came
many people. I mean, he was an employment force of pulling people together that have never done some of the things that they wanted to do for that series.
Oh yeah, I mean he might have been the North Star, right? But
yeah,
he certainly didn't do it alone. Like you look at Tim Burton, for example, my favorite director, who's done some really amazing creative works, and the movie that he's most known for is The Nightmare Before Christmas, probably the one he's most, Beetlejuice, other ones too. But interestingly enough, if you look at the documentary on that film, he was barely involved. Like conceptually, he was the creative voice, but it was really the team that put it together. I mean, he most often wasn't even on the set when they were doing the stop animation and everything else. But I do think, back to your comment though, I think that people are going to start to take advantage of this. But it still comes back to like, deep down human creativity. And why I say that is that even though now you've had the democratization of tools to allow people to create art, for example, right? We've got so much more music than we ever had, right? Because people are not relying on recording studios. But there's so much noise and there's so much garbage out there. Yeah. And really, the true artists are the ones that still rise to the top. If you look at the stuff that's truly great, it just really, you have an opportunity for people to achieve that couldn't have before. And I still think it's, back to your comment around movies, I still think it'll be the same thing. I think you'll see this proliferation of AI created stuff to the point where people go, well, yeah, that's nice, but where's the truly great stuff? And then the truly great stuff will still rise to the top. Ultimately, I think it just might mean that more people have the opportunity to participate, perhaps, right? In the meantime, we're going to see a lot of noise. We've seen that in the video game world, for example, with Nintendo came out with Nintendo Wii, and just about everybody had one in their house, and it was very easy for people to get a kit and develop a game on it. And what you saw was this avalanche of just absolute garbage software that was put out there. But you know what? Most of it just simply didn't sell. But maybe it gave people an opportunity to build something and have some fun and learn something. And maybe in 5 years' time, those are the people creating the really great video games on those systems. So like anytime you have this democratization, it really opens the floodgates, but it might just allow for that diamond in the rough to come forward and produce that really stellar song or video game or film, for example.
Yeah, the idea of, if you think about, let's just think about film here, AI is infiltrating everywhere, right? From a point of view of helping with script writing to analyzing the script and, basically predicting what the box office potential is and helping with casting and scheduling and planning and, arranging all the filming and coordinating with weather and all different aspects, right? Even during production, being able to dynamically shift ideas and modify things on the fly from a point of view of what was originally planned and what was originally set out, to even the post-production with editing tools, and being able to bridge content and shift scenes, and even interject some, we'll call it fakery, to cause that transition, introducing kind of unique musical scores from a formula. Those all those there are tools that are going to be available. Every last one of them, somebody did, right? Somebody helped before, right? So you are going to see displacement, right? Now, what does this mean, right? Are we going to be able to have, Joe down the street living in his garage, make the next great movie? Well, it's done. It's been done in the past, so it'll be done again. It's probably the quality will be better this time around.
Yeah,
right?
no, for sure.
Yeah.
We look at someone like Quentin Tarantino, who essentially was a nobody that worked in a video rental store, that had a vision, that watched a million movies and loved filmmaking, and ended up being one of the great filmmakers of our time.
Yep.
I mean, you could, on paper, you never figure that out, right? How did this guy, I mean, that's literally where he started. And I think if you go back and look at the story of how he filmed, I think it was Reservoir Dogs, where he literally reached out to these massive actors and sent them a script and said, hey, would you be interested? And never dreamed that they would be. And all of a sudden he had some great actors together and he made this film. And then, like I said, the rest is history. So it's, again, that was long before these tools were available. So now that they're available, like what might happen? I mean,
that
you're going to
sounds
see
a lot
some
like Pulp Fiction to me.
Yeah, potentially. To use a pun, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you're going to see some job displacement potentially. But again, is the general public going to really accept it, or is everything going to start to look very formulaic, right? And that was what, back to my earlier comment about the band Nirvana. That was the big reason why they succeeded, because it reached a point where music was very overproduced, right? And it was relied a lot on, drum machines and different techniques to create this music that just started to feel very fake, very lifeless, very void of personality. And all of a sudden you have this band that comes out with essentially, a sound that's very raw and very punk and didn't conform, and they just exploded, right? And there's no way that you would be able to calculate that. In fact, even the band themselves couldn't believe what was happening and was overwhelmed by kind of how they exploded across the world. And there was no way you couldn't sit on a computer and figure, okay, if I was to sit down right now with AI, I couldn't figure out how to create Nirvana or a Nirvana-like band in this day and age.
Yeah.
It would be impossible, because there's some things that are very unpredictable. But back to my point of, there will get to a point where everything is so sort of, I guess, like fake or polished over, or we end up in this uncanny valley and everything, that people are going to long for things that are organic, that are real, that are produced by humans. And so I think you'll see this pendulum swing where you'll see this huge proliferation of this stuff, but then you're going to end up inevitably with a backlash where a lot of that, all of a sudden the studios are going to realize, well, we've been able to do all this really cheap, but nobody really wants it. So like now we have to go back and figure things out. But you did see the recent strike in Hollywood. A lot of it was based on them, studios capturing the likeness of these actors and being able to use that using AI in the future for things. But there are some interesting aspects of that as well. If you look at, not too long ago, I watched that newest Indiana Jones film. We can argue about where it sits in that universe as far as you'll never beat the classics in our mind, right? But it was a really interesting movie in that they started out by showing a really younger version of Indiana Jones that was literally played by Harrison Ford, and through CGI, but some combination of AI, they were able to overlay a younger version of him on him. So he was able to act as his younger self in the movie, which again, it looked a little bit fake in the movie, but it was cool enough that I thought, oh, this is actually like an interesting concept that Harrison Ford could literally play a younger version of himself.
Exactly.
So there's where like AI enabled a certain type of creativity that I thought was actually interesting. Maybe not everybody did, but that was
original. right?
Yeah.
From a point of view of the artist is behind it, right? And that's where I think, what you talked about is society swaying into the new latest thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then basically, cycling back to what's authentic, what's real, what's really meaningful. And I think that's what, in the end, that's what, appreciating art is all about, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Really connecting to what works for you. Now, ultimately, can other, we'll call them original things, come out of that? So you think about, for instance, maybe for a film, maybe you have a new AI movie star, right? And this AI movie star works with real movie stars, right? Real actors. And this AI movie star, for some reason, it catches all the appeal of a public, that fires off into a long history of movies. Who knows, right? I don't know. Is that possible? Sure.
Oh, maybe like a modern day Roger Rabbit.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Animation's been doing it forever, right?
Yeah, that combination of that. Yeah, I mean, that's probably aging ourselves, but that was a major breakthrough back in the day, right? You had that movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit, where you had animated characters, and the movie was real characters, and it became like a sensation, right?
Yeah.
You had and then you had, what was the other movie, Howard the Duck? Where they brought in kind of a CGI character and interacted with real. You had that in Ghostbusters, right? So there's been a lot of that throughout the ages, but now we're getting to the point where it could be an actual human, right? But
yeah, I know when we were looking into this, planning out researching this one, the question that came to me was like, what the heck is art anyway? All right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's so many. It's just a wide definition. There's so much breadth to it. I mean, think about modern art. It's not painting necessarily.
Not anymore,
right?
Yeah.
It's sculptures. It's multimedia. It's all this stuff. It's just hard to explain, right?
It's NFTs.
yeah, it's that too, I guess. You think about that now. What's AI going? It's just going to be incorporated by the artist, right? In some form. Oh yeah, look, another idea I had, right, which has been, discussed. I should say I had it, but I uncovered in film before we jump back into the art was the idea of having, how you can buy books for your kids, and they're they based on how they respond, you can go to a different spot and you have a different story and blah blah blah, right? So you can have responsive storylines, right? With AI enabled playback, you could actually have films being presented uniquely based on with multiple types of endings, multiple types of material occurring throughout, based on feedback from the audience. Right? That's kind of original.
Yeah, they've tried some of that, like interactivity, where it's kind of like you choose an option and it shows you. They did that on Netflix at one point, but it was very static, right?
Yeah.
You make a choice, now it plays this clip instead of that clip. But to your point of, if it was AI, it was truly dynamic. Like because you'd almost be able to kind of forge your own story. There's a lot of potential for that, and they've done some of that in video games, but certainly now we start integrating AI into video games where things are dynamic. Right, there was I forget the name of the game right now, but there was a game on the market for a while that was basically dynamically generating planets where you could fly throughout the universe, and it was dynamically generating landscapes and life forms and everything else. That it wasn't something pre-programmed by. I mean, the whole thing was programmed, but it was sort of dynamically generating things. So everything was different for every player, and I mean that gets into a pretty wild scenario. But it also opens up a whole different level of potential creativity. But then, in that scenario, who's the artist then, right? Back to is AI the artist?
Well,
at that point, right?
In this case, it's the part of the process. I mean, the artist would be the idea of being able to make the movie in the first place. But, you implement all these different sensors and the arms of chairs and things like that to determine people's emotions and blah, 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 right? Mm-hmm. You get into this whole feedback loop that then drives, the whole movie unfolding. And you go see the movie, and what you saw, the hero dies, but your wife goes sees the movie, it's completely different, right?
Hard to have a conversation about the movie then, right?
Yeah, what the hell was that? Anyway, let's back to art. Art is very malleable, very dynamic, right?
Oh, for sure, yeah.
And the idea being that, there's many different methods and fabric behind it. I would say that, if we think about art being replicated with AI, in a fashion of, a previous artist and all the works of that artist, yes, we're the same thing as what we talk about with music. The idea of, is that a deep fake now? Right? When it creates a new work based on the subtleties of that particular original artist, and the AI creates this new piece. Would you be curious to listen to it or to look at it, to view it? Would you want to see this? We've analyzed the whole history of this particular, this particular artist, and we've come up with the AI has come with some new works. Would you click on that? Right?
Maybe out of morbid curiosity, but I think it's
morbid. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
But at the same time, it's it's still not going to be that, right? It's still not going to be a work by that person, because back to the the heart and soul of music is from people and experiences and culture and everything else, right? So it's going to be people have done that. There was a big kerfuffle there last year, I think it was, where somebody basically created a whole new stand-up of George Carlin, for example.
Oh, good old George,
yeah. People have various opinions on George. I mean, I think he was definitely a vanguard in his time and a poet and many different things, right? And certainly participated in a lot of commentary. It was comedy, but it was also social commentary. I mean, just a brilliant guy overall, whether you agree with everything he said or not. But I actually sat down and listened. I don't think I actually got through it all, because I was like, this is just, garbage, really, at the end of the day. It was interesting because it was like an approximation. So what you had was basically this AI version of George Carlin that was commenting on a lot of things that are happening now. And it was sort of made sense that you go, okay, I could see maybe George would have this take on what's going on in the political situation in the US, for example, right? Or whatever it is. But there was a big part of me that went, yeah, but you know what? He would have came up with something far smarter, far more biting.
Yeah.
What I was hearing was this sort of carbon copy of, and some approximation of what he might have said based on what he talked about back in the day. But it really wasn't it. And I was like, you know what? This is not the future of comedy, and let's let George lie. We don't need to regurgitate him and try to bring him into modern situations, right? I think we can all imagine the types of things he would have said, but the beauty of George was that he always said the things that you really, even if you knew him very well, he still said things that you didn't expect him to say. Right? It was that element of surprise and that element of creativity that simply, I mean, they proved it with this, that just couldn't be replicated, right?
Yeah. And I think the main thing here, if you think about it, is it just hasn't caught up yet, right? AI is just not there yet to make that big leap, right? Of analyzing. It just doesn't have enough parameters. It doesn't really go in enough depth to really create something original from, the basis of what was there. And that's just fine, The idea, though, that technology, though, can be used to basically analyze, right? So you can analyze, a painting of a particular collection and say, did this artist paint this or not, right? And there's some Swiss company that created something called art recognition, and that program isolated this particular painting, Samson and Delilah, and it was originally thought to be done by Peter Paul Rubens, and they've contested that. So it's already started, right? Where these tools are being utilized, right?
Yeah, that's a good place to take things as far as, we've talked a lot about, the potential for AI in art and where it can be utilized and where it can't replace humans and this and that. But the bottom line is that it's here and it's just going to proliferate even more, right? So what are some of the challenges or some of the issues that we're going to see a lot of, like you talked about, like, is this original? Was it done by this person, right? You can look at copyright ownership, authorship requirement, potential infringements on existing art, right? AI, generative AI uses a lot of source material, and will it create something that's a little too close to something somebody created, and is that, while it can be used as a tool, then what are the legal implications going to be? You've seen a lot of lawsuits over time of musical artists suing other musical artists. Back to, I mentioned earlier, this Dua Lipa song that sounds like another song from 20 years ago. But by and large, these artists have lost these cases because it's like, basically the argument is that, okay, it sounds like it, but the intent wasn't there, and there are only so many combinations of notes that sound good to the human ear, and this was just a coincidence, right? And I think that you're going to see more and more AI art and other outputs that you're going to see a lot of people trying to launch lawsuits, but I don't really think they're going to get anywhere with it, because historically they've lost. Now some of them have won cases, but a lot of them have lost the cases. But I think where it's going to head is that, and it's always been my opinion on it, is that, okay, sure, somebody can create something that looks like something you created or sounds like something you created, but they're still not you. And at the end of the day, if you're good at what you do, then people will pay you to not just create the art, but to show up and give the performance, right? And that oftentimes people show up at a concert because of the personality of the performer and where they sit in the culture and what they talk about, not simply because they can sing a particular, song, for example. And so I think that's the same thing with photography. Photographers spend an inordinate amount of time trying to protect copyrights on their images, but by and large, photographers make their money by being paid to show up and shoot a model or on a commercial film shoot or whatnot. So, for example, I forget the name right now, but a famous photographer once said that she doesn't spend, I think it was Annie, she doesn't spend any time pursuing copyright because she's like, people pay me for my time and I have no issues. I have a full career and they can try and copy me all they want, but they can't really copy me, right? And so I think you're going to see a lot of sort of legal finagling, but I don't know how far it's going to go. But on the other side, I do think that, this idea of deep fakery, or, we talked about Indiana Jones or whatever it is, the idea that you can take someone's image and then recreate things in their likeness. Because I think that's something that's sort of interesting, right? Because you might be able to create a song that sounds like another artist, but when they start actually replicating you as a person, I think that's probably going to be a bridge too far. So I think you're going to see a lot of people trying to protect their image, or maybe on the flip side, selling their image, right? You have an actor like Harrison Ford that maybe doesn't want to go act anymore. And if the technology gets good enough, he can just license his image and they can make Indiana Jones movies for the next 100 years. Will we want to go see them? I don't know. But there's certainly a lot of challenges around AI and art, the legal implications, the ethical use of things, the cultural and social impact of AI generated art, leading to homogenization, biases present in art, right? Where it's sort of, we've seen that where art generates things that just don't make sense historically and things like that. So we're sort of in the Wild West, I guess, right now, right? What do you think about that in terms of some of the sort of dangers or implications of where we're headed in terms of that?
Well, I think the major issue I see here is that, it has to do with history and copyright term and all that stuff, right? So, how long are those rights before they go into the public domain and all that kind of thing? So as an artist, from the past, is it okay to have AI create, 60 years later, is it okay to, for AI to create you and build out works that you would make? You're no longer there, right? So should we leave the dead alone, so to speak, and not look in the past and say, let's repeat and, let's reform and let's resurrect what's been done by, previous artists. I think to me, the AI has that, is going to have that very, strong capability of replicating and reproducing. Right? It's not very good today, like we talked about, but I think it will be in the future. And the ethical problem I see is actually applying that, right? Because who's going to benefit, right? Who is actually benefiting? And if it's some party now and it's not going to the estate, right? It's not going to the generation, the family, from the original artist. Why is that right?
Yeah, that's where it should be up to the artists, right? And artists have gone. I mean, you've seen instances of Queen and other artists just sell their entire music catalog to publishing companies, and they've done that essentially to set up their family and their estate for life. And that could be the same thing with Harrison Ford selling his likeness. Like, as long as it's up to the artist, I don't really see a problem with it. Now, to what degree that they'll be successful with it, I don't know. But that's where it's like, it still comes back to the artist having ownership and control over whatever it is, whether it's their likeness or their music or whatever. But it's an interesting area for sure. I don't know if we're going to solve right now, but certainly you're going to see a lot of precedents come out around that and what people want to do. I mentioned earlier the band Kiss selling their licenses for these hologram shows to go on forever. I think it's an interesting area that, as long as it sticks with the artist, that's the main thing. But we got to be careful around how it's being applied and so on. But again, we're in the Wild West, right? So when are we going to start our probability band, our AI band?
That'll be next year. Yeah,
we can create an awesome new theme song for the podcast,
right. And we'll have little avatars for us.
Yeah,
little AI avatars. We'll put them on YouTube.
Eventually, man, they'll be going out on tour, and they'll have autograph signing sessions and everything.
Yeah.
We'll live through it forever through our virtual avatars, right? So there you go, Patrick. We covered a lot of different subjects today, all the way from music through to literature and film and art, and we've come to some conclusion here. I think that essentially we're not going to replace humans with AI; that it can be used to augment things, but ultimately it's probably going to be another tool, and perhaps it'll branch out into different directions in the future. But what do you think in terms of where AI sits in the landscape of art?
I would say ultimately beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's all about the public discernment, what they deems valuable, right? And what they feel they are going to put their money to. I mean, the idea of the starving artist should be an idea. It shouldn't be a reality. Artists should be able to make, a living. And the idea is that they'll get compensation for their art. And that's what's really important here, is that you have that check and balance, right? So, I mean, our art is subjective. So you're going to have people that are going to really love, AI generated things, right? And at the same time, you're going to have people that are very, objective, and they want to see the art of the artist itself. So I think we're going to see an exciting time ahead of us for possibilities there. And at the same time, we're also going to see more legal battles. We're going to see job displacement, and we're going to see this concern that's being raised multiple times in all these different fields about the labeling of AI work and the transparency of work that is generated by AI versus, a person. And this is constantly come up. This is a theme that we've seen that needs to be addressed. So
yeah, I mean, it comes back to everything we've talked about in this season on the podcast. So this episode is kind of wrapping up our first season, which has been largely focused on AI. Yeah. And what have the themes been? That AI has been extremely disruptive to almost every industry imaginable, and the creative industry is no different. But really, when we look at it and look at some of the potential dangers and pitfalls and concerns, that it's all about striking a balance, right? And keeping a human in the loop, but ultimately holding on to our humanity somewhere in the midst of all this, and the heart and the soul of what makes us human. We can't lose that through this proliferation of AI and AI technologies. It simply cannot take over, but it definitely provides some interesting possibilities and probabilities for sure.
Thank you for listening to the Probability Podcast. Please join us next time for more musings from the generator and the discriminator.